Hello and welcome back everyone. For today's video we are having a new tournament which is Super United Croatia Rapid and Bloods. We will start off with the Rapid tournament. This is round 1 of the tournament and let's see how it goes. We are having Maxime Vachier-Lagrave from France faced off with Aronian Levon from America. So we get pawn d4 as the opening. We get knight to f6, pawn c4, and pawn g6, and we all know that MVL or Maxime Vachier-Lagrave likes to play the Grunfeld defense. So we get pawn to f3. This is anti-Grunfeld variation, and now we get pawn d5 from Maxime to trying to stop the pawn push on e4. So c takes d5 was played, knight takes d5, and now pawn to e4 anyways. We get knight to b6, and all of a sudden we are having the Aronian defense. The Aronian defense, which is basically starts with pawn to e4 and knight to f6, we get a similar position from that opening. This is why you need to be familiar with pawn structures because if you are in this position, then you gotta know what are you doing. So we get knight to c3, we get bishop to g7 from MVL, and now bishop to e3 to try to finish the development. We get short castle from MVL, and now Aronian goes queen to d2. Maybe Aronian is thinking to play bishop to h6 and castle queenside and go for the kingside attack with pawn h4, pawn h5. Who knows? So we get knight to c6 from MVL and now long castles from Aronian. Now this is a really tricky position and it's super complicated because you gotta play accurate in those positions, because it is one move error and you're immediately blown off the board. So you gotta be careful. So here MVL accurately plays queen to d6, and queen to d6 is trying to remaneuver the queen maybe to b4 to support that knight going to c4, or maybe trying to play for pawn to e5. Let's find out in just a second. So we get king to b1 from Aronian. Aronian is trying to hide his king and move his king to a safer place. And now we get pawn to a6 from MVL. Pawn a6 is basically a preventing move from preventing this knight from jumping to b5 and attacking the queen on d6. So we get pawn to d5 anyways from Aronian. And now you need to think about it. You need to think about going knight to e5 or knight to a5. Because first of all, if you play knight to e5, then maybe black could go queen to f2 and try to put the bishop on c5. And that's pretty annoying. But when you go to a5, queen to f2 right now is not really such a great idea due to bishop takes c3. And if white captures, then there is knight to a4 going for the big forks on c3. And at the same time, if this square on b6 gets free up from this bishop, then this check is going to be dangerous, as well as queen jumping to the a3 square. So it makes a lot of difference. MVL in the game went knight to a5, and now we get bishop to d4 from Levon, and now Maxime goes pawn to e5. He's saying, okay, you have two choices. You can take en passant and free up the position and let my bishop get into play, or you can just retreat your bishop. It is up to you. So Aronian thought, okay, I like my pawn on d5, I think it's pretty strong, so I will just retreat my bishop back to f2. So we get knight a to c4, putting the knight on a nice square, maybe preparing to go queen to b4 to trying to threaten some checkmates business. Then we get queen to c2 from Maxime, moving his queen away, and now bishop to h6 was played to try to dominate those dark squares and preventing the rook from going to d2. So when we play queen to b4, then there is a major pressure on the pawn on b2. So bishop takes c4 was immediately played, knight takes c4, and actually bishop takes c4 wasn't the great move because now the pawn on the b file is ready to attack. So we get rook to d3, and now bishop to d7 from MVL. MVL's finishing his development, and now Aronian goes knight g to e2, and now, okay, Lagrave says, okay, we are all done with this funny businesses, let's try to checkmate you, and plays pawn to b5. Okay, Aronian got really mad and said, okay, I will mate you as well, and he goes pawn to h4 trying to attack with pawn h5, and now we get pawn to b4 from Maxime. Maxime is trying to push really hard. The engine is saying that this is a mistake because after knight to a4, then you cannot move your pawns forward anymore. And actually, in fact, Maxime played that in the game. Now, if you traded that bishop for the knight, it is not such a good trade because after you try to defend your pawn with a5, then there is queen to b5 hitting the knight, and after the knight moves anyway, then pawn to b3 is going to be played, and the whole completely queenside is completely blocked. So Maxime instead went bishop to b5 to try to put this rook on some tricky situation that the bishop now is aiming at the rook. Maybe at any time this knight can sacrifice itself to win this rook. So we get pawn to h5 from Levon. Levon is saying, okay, I am not having fun. Also, I got to try to checkmate you. So MVL basically says, okay, go on. I will move my bishop so when you capture here, I can recapture without leaving my bishop hanging on h6. So here Maxime goes knight to c5, and now we get pawn to a5 from h takes g6 was played from Aronian, and now first taking with the h pawn is completely fine, but it gives white such a great advantage after this move with pawn to f4, because right now the whole king side is opening after you move your bishop, then f5 is coming, and it's really tricky situation to play on with the black pieces. And if you take with your f pawn, also you are weakening this square on e6, and white could jump there, hitting the rook and hitting the bishop, and white is doing pretty well. So Maxime here understands all of that and played queen takes g6. We get pawn to f4 anyways from Aronian, and now e takes f4. Of course, you cannot recapture back because it's defended by the bishop, but instead we get rook d to h3, hitting the pawn on h7. And now you got to defend yourself as black, and it's quite tricky because first of all, the pawn is undefended. You can try to push it to h6, but knight to d4 is such a strong move here for white. White is trying to jump to f5, and after the knight lands on f5, this pawn on h6 will be undefendable, and black will be in a worse situation. So Maxime says, okay, you can have the pawn on h7, you want it, take it, and he plays pawn to f3. And right now, if you try to go rook takes h7 as you white, then he will just take on e2. Because there is not really a checkmate after rook to h8, then there is king g7, and there is no rook to h7. Because right now, first of all, black can sacrifice his queen, but there is no need for that. He can just go and move his king, and there is nothing much to do with the white pieces. So after f3, Aronian saw that, and he was knight to d4, hitting the knight to f5. So now the king cannot run to g7 like the previous variation. Maxime went knight to d2 with check. We get king to a1 from Aronian. And now f takes g2, hitting the rook on h1. Now Aronian needs to play passive for some moves here. He's got to defend his rook. At the same time, he's got to stop this pass pawn on g2. But ho-ho, and Maxime here says, okay, you gave me a pass pawn on g2, I will take it and defend it. Of course, I am going to play bishop to f1. So we get bishop to e3 from Levon. Bishop takes e3. Rook takes e3, and remember, when you are up material, it's always a good idea to trade down the pieces. So rook takes e3, and now we get knight to c4 from Maxime. Maxime is hitting the rook on e3, and at the same time, he's trying to put pressure on the pawn on e4 a little bit. So we get rook to e2 from Levon. Levon is really trying to play in the game. He's feeling himself that he's completely out of the game with this strong bishop on f1, and this strong knight on c4 as well. So he thought, okay, I will sacrifice an exchange in order to get some counterplay. But of course, taking the rook here is not really such a great move, because after queen to e2, hitting the knight, at the same time he is hitting the pawn, and black's advantage still the same, but it is not really it's a tricky situation to be in, because right now you have to play the only move, which is queen to f6, counter attacking this knight. The idea behind it is that if white takes the knight, then there is queen to f2 hitting the rook, and you will have to play knight to e2, and it's weird variation where white gets two knights for the rook and the pass pawn he's got on g2. But here Maxime chooses to go knight to e5 to try maybe to aim for the f3 square or the g4 square, and maybe this knight on e5 is really supporting this pawn due to it is helping the march of the h pawn. So we get rook e takes g2, and now bishop takes g2, rook takes g2, and of course it seems like black is losing his queen, but thankfully there is knight to g4 in this position, and now we get knight to d7 from Levon, and that's a huge mistake. It is a huge mistake because right now in this position Maxime can play knight to e3. The idea behind it that after you capture my queen with check, I will take with the f pawn, opening up the f file, and at the same time I am hitting your queen with my knight. And after you move your queen, let's say queen to b1 for example, then rook to f1 is going to come and I am pinning your queen. And after all, I am an exchange up, and with these passed pawns on the king side, black is immediately winning the game. But in the game, MVL missed that idea and played pawn to h5 and responded the blunder with even another blunder. So we got knight takes f8 from Levon, rook takes f8 from Maxime, and now knight to f5. Knight f5 is of course threatening knight to e7 with check, forking the king and the queen. So Maxime defended it with rook to e8. We got rook to g1 from Aronian, and now king to h7 from Maxime. Maxime is trying to hide his king to try to prove that he's got an advantage with this pawn on h5. But of course, after all, the position should be equal, so let's see how the game continues. We've got rook to c1 from Aronian, putting pressure on the pawn on c7. And now instead of trying to defend the pawn with a passive move like rook to c8, and of course running to knight to e7, forking the queen and the rook, Maxime here chooses to play knight to f6, going back to counter-attack the pawn on e4. And it's always a great idea whenever your opponent is threatening something, is even to, rather than defending it, is to make an even bigger threat. Like this case, Maxime goes knight to f6 to hit the pawn on e4. We got queen to c7 from Aronian, and now rook takes e4 from Maxime. He is now threatening the knight on f5. So you got to do something about it. And he immediately went knight to e7 to attack the queen, and that was a major blunder again. And this time Maxime responded quite well and played queen to g5, aiming at the rook on the c1, but also at the same time aiming on the knight on e7. So let's see how it goes. We've got queen c2 from Aronian. Aronian is trying to pin that rook to the black king, and now we get queen to e5, threatening this knight even more. And also at the same time we are doubling on the e file, so maybe later on the game we can try to go rook to e2 and try to go for some quick mates on b2. We've got pawn to d6 from Aronian, trying to defend the knight. We've got queen takes d6, of course, hitting the knight once again. And now knight to c6 was played. And now we get queen to d5 from Maxime, rook to d1 from Aronian, and now queen to c4, forcing off the queens out of the board. We've got queen takes c4, rook takes c4, hitting the knight, knight takes a5, and we've got this endgame. This endgame is considered to be maybe a drawish if you look at it from far away, but when you get closer you will find out that black has got this outside pawn on the h file, which is so dangerous. But maybe white can hold the position, who knows, let's see. So we've got rook to f4 from Maxime. Maxime is trying to support his knight behind his pawn and also support the pawn push on h4 and keeping the rook, defending the pawn on b4. So we've got knight to c6, attacking the pawn on b4 once again. And now Maxime just says, okay, I am not really having it. Let's go pawn to h4, let's queen our pawn, and let's just call it a day, Levon. Levon says, okay, I will try to call it a day as well and try to queen my pawn. We've got b takes c3, b takes a3, this is the en passant, of course. And now, rather than taking and playing passively like most of us will do, Levon here chooses to play pawn to b4, because right now this knight is supporting the square of b4, and right now I am threatening as well to play b5 and try to queen my pawn. This is the counterplay I am talking about. But here the problem that this king gets weaker right now, and there is some mating nets that we can construct later on to try to checkmate white. So we've got knight to e4 from Maxime. This knight could head to c3 and try to play rook to f2 and try to deliver checkmate on a2 immediately. So we've got rook to h1 from Levon, trying to pin this rook to defend this pawn. We've got knight to c3 from Maxime. At the main time also, the knight on c3 is blocking the pawn from pushing to b5 since the knight is controlling it right now. So it's a really tricky endgame for both sides here who will win. So we get rook to c1 attacking the knight back again. we've got knight to d5, this time hitting the pawn on b4 and also blockading it from the b6 square. So we've got pawn to b5 and this pawn is marching over and it is super tricky right now. You need to be careful as black. So here Maxime went rook to f2. So if this rook moves away from defending that c3 square, then knight to c3 will be a deadly threat with the checkmating net on a2. So we've got rook to c4. Of course, the eye of the rook cannot move away from the c3 square. We've got king to g7. Maxime saying, okay, you can take my pawn. But of course, the idea behind it that if white intended to take the pawn, then knight to c3 will immediately end the game. So after king to g7, Maxime chooses to play knight to b4, which was pretty much the final mistake, because right now Maxime just plays it easily and traded on b4. The idea behind it that after rook takes b4, then h3, and I am fixing my pawn on h2, and with your king cut off on the second rank, it is a simple win. So let's see how it finishes. It finishes with pawn to b6. So we've got h2 from Maxime. We've got rook to b1 to try to stop this pawn from queening, and now Maxime plays rook to b2, hitting the rook and also at the same time hitting the pawn on b6. We've got rook to h1 and now pawn f5 from Maxime. The idea behind it, okay, you cannot take the pawn because if you try to take and push, my rook will come back to h8 and you have nothing. Levon says, okay, let me try to hope for something with this pawn on b7. But Maxime didn't really have it and just took the pawn. Now the idea behind it that, okay, yes, I lose my pawn on h2, but after king to f6, this pawn is just marching forward. This king is cut off on the a file, and this is just a simple win. So Levon Aronian resigns the game, and MVL went on to win his first round of the tournament. Make sure, guys, to drop a like and see you in the next videos. Also, if you want to try to check our latest videos, we covered the last tournament, which is Norway Chess 2024, pretty well. Make sure to check it out and see you in the next rounds of this tournament.